remembered the day humanity was cast out. She was 43 years old then, standing in the great chamber of the Galactic Concord, watching 12 alien species vote to expel her entire race from civilized space. The vote was unanimous. Not a single species spoke in humanity's defense. Not one delegate hesitated before casting their decision. Humans were deemed too volatile, too aggressive, and too unpredictable to remain among the stars. That was 15 years ago, was 58 now, and the memory still burned like fire in her chest. She stood at the window of her office in Geneva, looking out at a city that had changed so much since the expulsion. Earth had been forced to adapt. When the Concord cut humanity off from faster-than-light trade routes, the global economy nearly collapsed. When alien medical technology was confiscated, millions died from diseases that could have been cured with a simple injection. When the great powers of the galaxy turned their backs, humanity learned a painful truth. They were alone in the universe, and no one was coming to help them. But humans did what humans have always done. They survived, they adapted, they grew stronger. Turned away from the window as her assistant entered the room. Park was 27 years old, born 3 years after the expulsion. He had never seen an alien in person. He had never walked through a field with beings from 100 different worlds. To him, the Galactic Concord was ancient history, something he read about in textbooks and watched in old documentary footage. He carried 2 cups of coffee and accepted one with a tired smile. She liked. He was smart and curious and optimistic in ways that people her age had forgotten how to be. He asked questions about the old days sometimes, and answered when she had the energy. Today was not one of those days. "Anything new?" she asked, knowing the answer would be no. Her position as Secretary of External Affairs was ceremonial at best. There were no external affairs to manage. Earth had been isolated for 15 years, and the silence from the stars was absolute. Hesitated. That hesitation made set down her coffee. "Something came through this morning," he said, "on the old frequencies, the ones we haven't used since the expulsion." Felt her heart skip. The old frequencies were conquered diplomatic channels, encrypted pathways that humanity had been locked out of when they were expelled. No one should be contacting Earth through those channels. No one had any reason to. "Show me," she said. Led her to the communications center, a room filled with equipment that had gathered dust for years. A technician named Martinez sat at the main console, her face pale and confused. On the screen before her was a message written in Standard Galactic, the common language of the Concord. Read it 3 times to make sure she understood. The Galactic Concord formally requests an audience with representatives of Earth. Matters of urgent importance require discussion. A delegation will be received at point in 14 standard days. Your presence is respectfully requested. Respectfully requested. Those 2 words stood out like a beacon. The Concord had never requested anything from humanity. They had demanded, ordered, and commanded. They had treated humans like unruly children who needed to be disciplined and controlled, but they had never asked politely. Something had changed. Something had shaken the foundations of galactic power enough that the mighty Concord was reaching out to the species they had thrown away like garbage. Did not smile. She did not feel vindicated or triumphant. She felt only a cold, careful curiosity. "Get me a line to the Security Council," she said, "and prepare a ship. We're going to find out what they want." The journey to point took 11 days. Spent most of that time reviewing old files and preparing herself mentally for what lay ahead. Traveled with her as her aide, along with a small security detail and a diplomatic support team. They traveled aboard a human vessel called the Steadfast, a ship that had been built entirely with Earth technology. It was slower than Concord vessels, less elegant and less efficient, but it was theirs. Point was a massive station at the edge of Concord space, a neutral ground where different species could meet without the political complications of visiting each other's. Had been there twice before the expulsion, and she remembered it as a bustling hub of activity and commerce. Ships from a dozen species would dock at its ports. Diplomats and traders and scientists would fill its corridors. When the Steadfast arrived, the station was nearly empty. Only a handful of ships were docked, and most of them looked old and poorly maintained. The corridors that walked through were quiet and dim, as if someone had forgotten to turn on all the lights. Walked beside her, his eyes wide with wonder and confusion. This was his first time seeing alien architecture, his first time breathing recycled air that had passed through non-human lungs. Could see him struggling to process everything at once. They were escorted to the main council chamber by a pair of guards. There were tall beings with 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected light like shattered mirrors. They moved with precise, mechanical efficiency, and they did not speak a single word during the entire walk. The chamber itself was smaller than remembered, or perhaps it only seemed that way because so many seats were empty. 12 species had once sat in this room. Now there were only 7. 5 delegations were missing, their seats dark and abandoned. Recognized the empty places. Though a species of aquatic beings who breathed through specialized suits. The massive creatures of living stone who had built the greatest structures in the galaxy. The gentle telepaths who had served as mediators in countless disputes. The brilliant engineers whose technology had advanced civilization by centuries. And the ancient and wise, the founders of the conquered itself. All gone, all absent. 5 empty seats where 5 great species had once shaped the destiny of the galaxy. Took her place at the human delegation's table, a spot that had been hastily prepared for guests who had not been welcome here in 15 years. Sat beside her, his hands trembling slightly. High Arbiter Consul rose from the delegation. Was old, even by standards. Her carapace was faded and cracked, and she moved with the careful slowness of someone who had lived too long and seen too much. Ambassador said, "Thank you for coming." "I'm not an ambassador anymore," replied. "Your conquered made that clear when you expelled my species." Lowered her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that might have been shame. "Much has changed since that day," she said. "We have made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and now we face the consequences of our arrogance." Leaned forward. "Then tell me, what has happened to the missing species? Where are thee and all the others?" The silence that followed was heavy and terrible. The remaining delegates looked at each other with expressions that recognized despite their alien features. Fear, despair, hopelessness. "They are gone," said at last, "erased from existence, and if we cannot stop what is coming, we will be next." Listened as explained what had happened to the galaxy in the 15 years since humanity's expulsion. The story was almost too terrible to believe. It had started in the outer territories, far beyond the borders of conquered space. Ships began to disappear. At first, the conquered assumed it was pirates or smugglers, the usual dangers of deep space travel. They sent patrol vessels to investigate. Those vessels never returned. Then entire colonies went silent. Outposts that had reported normal operations one day simply stopped transmitting the next. When rescue teams arrived, they found nothing. Not ruins, not wreckage, not bodies. Just empty worlds where thriving settlements had once existed. It was as if someone had reached down and erased everything that had been there. The conquered named the threat the silence, because that was all it left behind. Silence and emptiness and the terrible knowledge that something had been lost forever. There were the first major species to fall. There was a water planet called home to over 12 billion beings. The conquered received a final transmission from that lasted only seconds. It was a scream of pure terror, and then there was nothing. When conquered ships arrived at the coordinates where should have been, they found only empty space. The planet was gone. The moons were gone. Even the star that had orbited was gone, replaced by a dark void that swallowed light and hope. The fell next, and then the. Each time the pattern was the same. A brief moment of panic, a desperate attempt to flee or fight, and then absolute erasure. The silence did not conquer. It did not negotiate. It simply removed things from existence as if they had never been. The founders of the conquered had been the most recent victims. Their fall had shaken the remaining species to their core. They were ancient beyond measure, a civilization that had existed when most other species were still learning to use fire. If even they could be erased, then nothing in the galaxy was safe. "We have engaged the silence 17 times," said. "We have lost 17 times. Our weapons do not harm their vessels. Our shields do not protect us. Our strategies do not work. They move through our fleets like wind through grass, and when they pass, nothing remains." Absorb this information slowly. Beside her was typing notes on a small device, his fingers shaking with each keystroke. "Why are you telling us this?" asked. "You expelled humanity. You called us barbarians and warmongers. You said we were a threat to galactic stability. Why come to us now?" His compound eyes reflected the dim lights of the chamber. "Because we were wrong. We expelled your species for the very traits that might save us now. Humans are aggressive. Humans are unpredictable. Humans fight even when victory seems impossible. These were the qualities we found so disturbing. These are the qualities we now desperately need." The other delegates murmured in agreement, saw desperation in their alien faces, a willingness to admit error that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. Pride meant nothing when extinction was the alternative. "You want us to fight your war," said. "We want you to help us survive," replied. "The silence will not stop at conquered borders. If we fall, your species will be next. This is not just our war. It is a war for the survival of all life in the galaxy." Turn 2. He was young enough to see this situation with fresh eyes, unclouded by the old resentments that burned in her heart. "What do you think?" she asked him quietly. Looked up from his notes. "I think they're terrified. I've never seen beings like this before, but I know what fear looks like. They're not asking for help because they suddenly respect us. They're asking because they have no other choice." Nodded slowly. Was right. The conquered was not offering friendship or reconciliation. They were offering a transaction. Humanity's aggression in exchange for a chance at survival. "I need to consult with my government," said Tu. "This decision is not mine to make alone." "Of course," said, "but please understand that time is short. The silence is moving toward the core systems. Our projections suggest that Prime Mai will be targeted within 60 standard days. If it falls, the conquered's political structure collapses entirely. There will be no coordinated resistance. Each species will face the silence alone." Rose from her seat. "You will have our answer within 10 days. I suggest you use that time to prepare whatever forces you have left." She turned to leave, but's voice stopped her. "Ambassador, there is something else you should know." Waited. "The silence does not just destroy, it erases. When a species falls, all records of their existence begin to fade. Ship logs rewrite themselves. Database entries disappear. Even memories become unclear. They had a civilization that lasted for 40,000 years. Now I struggle to remember what they looked like. Their art, their music, their history, all of it is slipping away like sand through fingers." The weight of those words settled over like a heavy blanket. "If we fall," continued, "the galaxy will forget that the conquered ever existed. If your species falls, the universe will forget that humans ever reached the stars. It will be as if none of us ever mattered at all." His face had gone pale, understood why. Death was one thing. Every living being faced death eventually. But erasure was something else entirely. To be forgotten, to have your entire existence wiped from the memory of the universe, that was a fate worse than any death. "We will be in touch," said, and she led her delegation out of the chamber. The journey back to Earth felt longer than the journey out. Spent most of it staring at the stars through the viewport of the Steadfast, wondering how many of those distant lights had already been swallowed by the silence. How many civilizations had been erased while humanity was isolated in their little corner of the galaxy, unaware of the horror that was consuming everything else? Found her on the third night of the voyage, sitting alone in the observation deck with a cup of cold coffee in her hands. "Do you think they deserve our help?" he asked. Considered the question carefully. Deserve is a complicated word. They treated us badly. They judged us without understanding us. They threw us away because we made them uncomfortable. But does that mean they deserve to be erased from existence? Does anyone deserve that? Sat down beside her. "What will you recommend to the council?" Looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the silence was moving, consuming worlds and erasing memories. Somewhere out there, the remnants of galactic civilization were waiting to see if humanity would answer their call. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I know that whatever we decide, it will define what kind of species we are. We can hold onto our anger and watch the galaxy burn, or we can prove that we're better than the conquered believed. The choice is ours." Nodded slowly. He was young, but he understood the weight of what lay ahead. The Steadfast continued its journey through the dark void of space, carrying a decision that would shape the fate of everything. The United Earth Security Council met in Geneva 3 days after its return. Representatives from every major nation gathered in the Great Assembly Hall, their faces grim and uncertain. Stood at the central podium and told them everything she had learned. She showed them the data that the Conquered had shared, the images of empty space where planets had once orbited, the final transmissions from dying worlds. She told them about the silence and the erasure, and the desperate plea from species who had once cast humanity out like unwanted trash. When she finished speaking, the hall was silent for a long moment. Then the arguments began. Admiral Grace was the first to speak. She was 61 years old, a veteran of Earth's defense forces who had spent the last 15 years building a military that needed no alien technology to function. She had gray hair and hard eyes, and a voice that carried across the chamber like thunder. "We have to help them," she said. "I know how that sounds, I know what they did to us, but this isn't about revenge or justice or wounded pride. This is about survival. The silence will not stop at conquered borders. If we let the galaxy fall, we will be next. And we will face that threat alone, without allies, without intelligence, without resources. That is a fight we cannot win." Senator Cole rose to oppose her. He was younger then, a politician who had built his career on the resentment that many humans felt toward the Conquered. His voice was sharp with barely contained anger. "Why should our children die for species that despised us? The Conquered called us barbarians. They said we were a stain on galactic civilization. They cut us off from technology that could have saved millions of lives. Now they come crawling back because they need our violence, our aggression, our willingness to fight. We are nothing to them but a weapon to be used and discarded." The debate raged back and forth for hours. Old wounds were opened. People who had lost family members during the chaos that followed the expulsion spoke of their pain and their fury. Others argued that humanity had always been better than its enemies believed, and that this was a chance to prove it once and for all. Listened to all of it. She did not take sides. She had presented the facts, and now the decision belonged to the council. On the second day of debate, a young woman named Sarah took the floor. She was 28 years old, a scientist who worked on atmospheric restoration projects. She had no military background, no political connections, nothing that should have given her voice any special weight. But when she spoke, people listened. "I lost my grandmother during the medical crisis after the expulsion," she said. "She had a condition that could have been cured with conquered medicine. Instead, she died slowly over the course of 2 years. I watched it happen. I held her hand at the end. So believe me when I say that I understand the anger in this room. I feel it too." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But my grandmother told me something before she died. She said that holding onto hatred was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to suffer. The Conquered hurt us. That is true. But if we let the galaxy burn because of that hurt, we are not punishing them. We are punishing ourselves. We are proving that we are exactly what they always said we were, a species too consumed by rage to see beyond its own wounds. The chamber was quiet. Sarah continued. I don't want to save the conquered because they deserve it. I want to save them because we deserve to be more than what they believed us to be. I want my children to grow up in a galaxy that remembers humanity, not as barbarians, but as the species that answered when the universe called for help. The vote was held on the fourth day. It was close, closer than anyone had expected. But when the final count was announced, the decision was clear. Earth would send a fleet to aid the Galactic Conquered in its fight against the Silence. Admiral was placed in command of the expeditionary force. She had 47 ships at her disposal, crewed by volunteers who understood that they might never return. These were not the sleek, elegant vessels of the Conquered. They were human ships, built with human technology, armed with human weapons, that fired solid slugs at incredible velocities, missile systems that could overwhelm point defenses through sheer numbers, nuclear warheads that could crack planets if necessary. The Conquered had abandoned such crude weapons centuries ago. They relied on energy beams and phase disruptors and other technologies that seemed like magic compared to human hardware. But human weapons had one advantage that no one had considered important until now. They were simple. They were brutal. They did not care about phase states or dimensional frequencies or any of the exotic physics that the Silence used to protect itself. Mass was mass. Kinetic energy was kinetic energy. A slug traveling at a fraction of the speed of light would hit its target with devastating force, regardless of whether that target existed fully in normal space or not. Did not travel with the fleet. Her work was diplomacy, not warfare. But she stood on the observation deck of Earth Station Prime as the ships departed, watching them accelerate toward the distant stars. Stood beside her, his face unreadable. "Do you think they can win?" he asked. Shook her head slowly. "I don't know. No one has ever beaten the Silence, but if anyone can find a way, it will be us. Humanity has always been good at impossible things." The fleet vanished into the darkness, carrying the hopes of two civilizations on its shoulders. Earth went quiet, waiting for news that might never come. Families gathered around communication terminals, hoping to hear that their loved ones were still alive. Children asked questions that their parents could not answer. And somewhere in the vast emptiness between stars, Admiral reviewed her battle plans and prepared to face an enemy that had never known defeat. She was not afraid. She had spent her entire career preparing for a fight that might never come. Now it had come, and she was ready. The first reports arrived 3 weeks later. The fleet had reached Conquered space without incident. They had linked up with the remaining Conquered forces near Prime. The Silence had been detected moving toward the system, a wave of darkness that swallowed light and hope. The battle would begin within days. Read the reports alone in her office, her coffee growing cold on her desk. She thought about the young volunteers who had signed up for this mission, people who had never seen an alien before the Conquered's call for help. She thought about Sarah's grandmother, dying slowly while the galaxy that could have saved her looked the other way. She thought about what it meant to be human in a universe that had tried to forget them. And she waited, like everyone else on Earth, for the news that would decide the fate of everything. Admiral Grace stood on the bridge of the carrier Endurance and watched the Silence arrive. It came from the darkness between stars like a wave of absolute night, a fleet of vessels that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. The shapes were wrong in ways that hurt the eyes to look at. They were not built according to any physics that human engineers understood. They simply existed, moving through space as if the rules that governed normal matter did not apply to them. The Conquered fleet had gathered near Prime, 237 vessels from 7 different species. They formed a defensive line around the planet, their weapons charged and their shields raised. that had over 4 billion citizens on the surface below. If the silence broke through, all of them would be erased from existence. Human fleet took position on the flank of the conquered formation. 47 ships against an enemy that had never been defeated. The math was not encouraging, but had never put much faith in math. She had put her faith in the stubborn refusal of humanity to accept impossible odds. The conquered admirals had transmitted their battle plans to the human fleet. They were elegant and precise, built on centuries of tactical doctrine and mathematical modeling. Ships would maintain formation. Fire would be coordinated. Maneuvers would be synchronized. Everything would be orderly and controlled. Read the plans carefully. Then she set them aside and prepared her own. "All ships," she said into the fleet-wide communication channel, "ignore the conquered tactical framework. We fight our way, scatter formation on my mark. Target priority is any silence vessel that shows damage. Once we find a weakness, we exploit it until there's nothing left. No retreat, no surrender. Make them remember what humanity can do." The conquered admirals transmitted urgent protests. This was not how civilized species fought. This was chaos. This was madness. Smiled grimly. "Madness is all we've got. Let's see if it's enough." The silence fleet advanced. The conquered vessels opened fire first, their energy beams slicing through the void with precision and power. The beams struck the silence vessels and passed straight through them, as if the enemy ships were made of shadow rather than solid matter. Not a single silence vessel was damaged. Then the silence returned fire. Beams of absolute darkness lanced out from the enemy fleet, and wherever they touched a conquered vessel, that vessel simply ceased to exist. No explosions, no debris, no wreckage. Ships were there one moment and gone the next, erased from reality as if they had never been built. The conquered fleet lost 18 vessels in the first minute of combat. Gave the order, "Human fleet engage, scatter and attack." The 47 human ships broke formation and dove into the chaos. They did not move in coordinated patterns. They did not follow predictable attack runs. They swarmed like angry hornets, each captain making independent decisions based on what they saw in front of them. The silence had never encountered anything like this. Their targeting systems, designed to predict and eliminate orderly threats, struggled to track enemies that behaved with no apparent logic. Commander Lisa piloted the destroyer relentless through the heart of the enemy formation. Her ship was small and fast and armed with the most powerful in the human fleet. She had spent 15 years training for a fight that everyone thought would never come. Now it was here, and she intended to make it count. "Target the nearest silence vessel," she ordered. "Full power to the main gun." Her weapons officer, a young man named who was no relation to, locked onto an enemy ship. Target acquired. Firing. The activated with a sound like thunder. A solid tungsten slug, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light, crossed the gap between the relentless and the silence vessel in less than a heartbeat. It struck the enemy ship dead center. The silence vessel shuddered. A crack appeared in its hull, a wound that leaked something that might have been light or might have been blood. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the vessel began to fragment, breaking apart into pieces that dissolved into nothing as they tumbled through space. Lisa stared at her display in disbelief. Did we just kill one of them? Checked his sensors 3 times before answering. Confirmed. Target destroyed. The first silence vessel to fall in recorded history. The news spread through the combined fleet in seconds. Human weapons worked. The crude, primitive, brutal weapons that the conquered had mocked for centuries actually worked. The silence could be hurt. The silence could be killed. Hope, that most dangerous of human emotions, began to spread. The battle raged for 19 hours. The human ships took terrible losses. 12 vessels were destroyed, their crews erased from existence just like the conquered ships that fell. But the humans fought with a ferocity that the silence had never encountered. They did not retreat when their shields failed. They did not surrender when their weapons ran dry. They rammed enemy vessels if they had nothing else left to throw. The conquered forces, inspired by the human example, began to adapt. Engineers jury-rigged kinetic weapons from whatever materials they could find. Telepaths, the few survivors of their species, linked minds with human captains to coordinate attacks in ways that transcended normal communication. The battle became a desperate dance of innovation and sacrifice. When the silence finally retreated, Prime still stood. 23 conquered vessels had been lost. 12 human ships were gone. But 41 silence vessels had been destroyed, more than had fallen in all previous engagements combined. Admiral surveyed the aftermath from the bridge of the Endurance. Her uniform was stained with sweat and blood from a minor wound she had not noticed during the battle. Her hands were shaking with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright with something that had been missing from the galaxy for a very long time. "Send a message to Earth," she ordered. "Tell them we won. Tell them the silence can be beaten. And tell them we're going to need more ships." On the surface of Prime, 4 billion citizens looked up at the sky and wept. They had expected erasure. Instead, they had been saved by the species that their ancestors had expelled for being too violent, too aggressive, too human. High Arbiter received the battle report in her chambers. She read it 3 times, her compound eyes struggling to process what she was seeing. The humans had done the impossible. They had found a way to hurt an enemy that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations could not even scratch. She thought about the vote that had expelled humanity 15 years ago. She thought about the arguments that had been made, the fears that had been expressed. Humans were dangerous, the delegates had said. Humans were unpredictable. Humans could not be trusted to behave in civilized ways. All of those things were true, and all of those things had just saved 4 billion lives. Began to compose a message to the remaining conquered species. The war was not over. The silence would return with more vessels and new tactics. But for the first time since this nightmare began, there was hope. And that hope had come from the most unlikely source imaginable. The barbarians had become the saviors. The outcasts had become the heroes. The species that the galaxy had thrown away had proven themselves more valuable than anyone had imagined. Humanity had answered the call, and the silence had learned, for the first time in its existence, what it meant to be afraid. The weeks following the Battle of Prime changed everything. News of humanity's victory spread through the remaining conquered systems like wildfire, carried by refugees and traders and diplomats who could barely believe what they were reporting. The silence had been beaten. The unstoppable force had been stopped. And the species responsible for this miracle was the same one that the galaxy had expelled 15 years ago for being too dangerous. Human tactical doctrines became the most requested information in conquered space. Species that had never built kinetic weapons began manufacturing and missile systems. Engineers who had spent their careers refining elegant energy weapons now studied the crude physics of mass and velocity. The old ways had failed. The human ways worked. But it was not just the weapons that made the difference. Admiral understood that better than anyone. She spent the weeks after the battle meeting with conquered commanders, trying to explain what had happened and why. The conversations were often frustrating. "Your attack patterns made no sense," an admiral complained during one briefing. "Your ships moved without coordination. There was no mathematical optimization. How did you know what to do?" Considered the question carefully. "We didn't know, not exactly. We trusted our captains to make decisions based on what they saw. We gave them a goal and let them figure out how to achieve it. That's not chaos. That's flexibility." The admiral's compound eyes flickered with confusion. "But how can you win a battle without a precise plan?" "By being willing to change the plan when it stops working," said. "The silence expected you to behave in predictable ways. That's why their targeting systems were so effective against your fleets. We gave them something they couldn't predict: individual judgment. human stubbornness, the refusal to accept that we were supposed to lose. The Admiral considered this for a long moment. "Your species is very strange," she said at last. "We know," replied with a slight smile. "That's kind of the point." On Earth, the mood was cautiously optimistic. The victory had come at a cost. 12 ships lost, hundreds of crew members erased from existence. Families mourned. Memorial services were held, but there was also a sense of pride that had been missing since the expulsion. Humanity had been cast out of the galactic community, and they had answered by saving it. Watched the celebrations from her office in Geneva. She was tired in ways that sleep could not fix. The work of diplomacy was just beginning. The conquered had reached out in desperation, but rebuilding trust after 15 years of isolation would take much longer than a single battle. Park found her there late one evening, staring at a holographic map of conquered space. The territories of the erased species were marked in gray, dead zones where nothing remained. "The formal ceremony is tomorrow," said. "The conquered is reinstating humanity's membership. Full privileges, voting rights, everything we lost." Nodded slowly. "I know." "Are you going to attend?" "Of course, it's my job." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the gray zones on the map. "But I keep thinking about what's said, about how the erased species are being forgotten. All of them. Their histories are fading from memory. Even the people who knew them are starting to forget." Was quiet for a moment. "That won't happen to humanity. We proved ourselves. The galaxy will remember what we did." Will they? Turn to face him. Or will they remember us the way they always have? As the violent species, the aggressive ones, the barbarians who were useful when there was fighting to be done. We saved Prime. But did we change how they see us? Or did we just confirm their worst assumptions? It was a question without an easy answer. Did not try to provide one. The reinstatement ceremony was held at Point, in the same chamber where the conquered had once voted to expel humanity. The 7 remaining species sent their highest representatives. Holographic monuments to the erased species lined the walls, flickering images of civilizations that were already becoming unclear in the collective memory of the galaxy. High Arbiter presided over the ceremony. She was older than she had been when first met her carapace more faded, her movements more careful. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to press down on her like a physical burden. 15 years ago, this conquered made a decision that we believed was wise, said, her voice carrying through the silent chamber. We expelled the human species from our community. We called them dangerous. We called them volatile. We feared what they might do if allowed to remain among us. She paused and saw something she had never expected to see in his eyes. Shame. We were wrong. Not just wrong in our judgment, but wrong in our understanding of what makes a species valuable. We prized order and predictability. We valued civilizations that behaved according to mathematical models. We saw humanity's chaos as a flaw to be feared. Turned to face the human delegation directly. We did not understand that chaos can be a gift. We did not understand that unpredictability can be a weapon. We did not understand that the stubborn refusal to accept defeat is not a sign of barbarism. It is a sign of hope. She lowered her head in a gesture of profound respect. On behalf of the Galactic Conquered, I formally apologize for the expulsion of humanity. I invite your species to rejoin our community with full rights and privileges. And I thank you, from the depths of my being, for answering our call when we had no right to ask for your help. The chamber was silent, rose from her seat and walked to the central platform where stood. The 2 women, human and faced each other across a gulf of years and wounds and misunderstanding. We accept your invitation, said, and we accept your apology. She did not say that the wounds were healed. She did not say that the past was forgotten. Some wounds took longer than others to close and was not willing to pretend otherwise. But acceptance was a start. It was a foundation on which something new could be built. After the ceremony, a young diplomat approached as the delegations mingled. She was barely an adult by standards, one of the youngest officials in the chamber. "I have a question," she said hesitantly, "if you are willing to answer." Nodded, "Go ahead." "Why did you come? Your species was treated badly by the conquered. You had every reason to refuse our request. Yet you came anyway, and you fought for us, and you died for us. I do not understand why." Thought about the question for a long moment. He thought about Sarah's speech to the Security Council. He thought about the 12 ships that would never return to Earth. He thought about what it meant to be human in a galaxy that had tried to forget them. "Because you asked," he said at last, "and because it was the right thing to do, that's usually enough for us." The young's eyes flickered with confusion. But how can such a simple reason explain such a great sacrifice? Smiled slightly. "Maybe it's simple to you. For us, doing the right thing has never been simple. It's hard and it hurts and sometimes it costs everything. But we do it anyway. That's what makes us who we are." They did not understand, could see that clearly, but that was all right. Understanding would come in time or it would not. Humanity did not need to be understood by the galaxy. They just needed to be themselves. And they needed to be remembered. Standing at the edge of the chamber, watched the conversations unfolding around her. Humans and aliens talking, arguing, laughing, beginning the slow work of rebuilding what had been broken. The galaxy was still wounded. The silence was still out there. The erased species were still fading from memory. But there was hope now. Hope that had been carried across the stars by 47 ships and the stubborn human refusal to let the darkness win. That hope would have to be enough, because in the end, hope was all that any species really had. The conquered had forgotten that truth somewhere along the way. Humanity never had. And now, thanks to the sacrifice of those who had fought at Prime, the galaxy would remember it again.